Her last breath in the snow beside her stillborn. A Lakota chief warmed them both back. The fire had burned down to coals by the time I found her. I wasn't looking for anything. I was walking because I couldn't sleep, and I hadn't been sleeping much for 2 winters by then. You walk the perimeter when the camp is quiet and the dogs are still. It's what a chief does habit, or maybe just the need to feel useful in the dark when usefulness has been taken from you. The snow was shin-deep, and the clouds had broken apart above the western ridge, and the moon was hard and white as bone. That's when I heard it. Not a sound exactly, more like the absence of a sound that should have been there. The wind had dropped, and there was something in the stillness that wasn't right. I've hunted long enough that I know the difference between silence that means nothing and silence that means the land is holding its breath. I stopped. I waited. And then I heard it, a sound so small I thought for a moment it was a bird or the creak of a frozen branch. An exhale, too slow, like something emptying itself. I moved toward the tree line. She was in the snow beneath a cottonwood at the edge of the creek bed, maybe 30 steps off the trail. Lying on her side, one arm stretched out ahead of her as if she'd been reaching for the tree when she went down. She was Lakota. I could see that from the beadwork on her robe, the way her hair was braided but not our band. I'd never seen her. The snow around her knees was dark in the moonlight, and I knew what that meant before I knelt beside her, and when I pressed my hand to her throat her skin was cold enough that I thought I was too late. Then the pulse moved under my fingers, faint, like a moth against glass. The child was beside her, wrapped in a piece of hide, tucked against her belly as if she'd done it with her last useful movement. I touched the small bundle, still. I stood there a moment, not long. You don't stand long in cold like that. I picked her up. She was lighter than I expected, the way the very ill always are, as if sickness burned something off that has no name. I carried her back to camp with one arm under her knees and one at her back and her head against my collarbone, and I felt her breath on my jaw, shallow, irregular, barely there, and I talked to her the whole way. Not words she could hear, just sound, the way you talk to a horse that's down. I brought her to my lodge. My sister Witchhandpy was awake. She's always awake, has been since her husband died. She just sits and does beadwork in the dark. And she came across the camp when she saw me carrying something, and she lifted the flap of my lodge without being asked and went in before me to tend the fire. By the time I'd laid the woman down on the sleeping robes, Witchhandpy had the flames up and was already pulling back the robe to see how bad it was. Bad enough that my sister looked at me once with her eyes flat and calm and said, "Go heat water." And I did, because some things you don't deliberate about. You just do the next thing. I want to tell you what I remember about that night, but it's strange how memory works. Some of it is very clear, the smell of the woman's hair when I leaned close to check her breathing, something like pine resin and smoke, the particular sound the water made when it came to boil over the fire, the way the wind found a gap in the lodge cover around the 3rd hour and came through cold and thin as a needle. Other parts are just shapes, my sister's hands moving. My own hands, not knowing what to do with themselves, eventually taking up a scraper and working a piece of hide just to have something to occupy them. The woman didn't speak. She shook. For a long time she shook so hard the robes trembled and Witchhandpy held her, and I added wood to the fire until the lodge was hot enough that I had to take off my shirt, and still she shook. At some point near dawn the shaking eased. My sister slept sitting up, still holding her, and I sat across the fire and watched them both and did not sleep. I should tell you who I was by then. My name is Chantachhilla. It means something like dear to the heart, which is a name my mother gave me that I haven't felt I deserved for a long time. I was chief of a small band on the western edge of Pahasapa, Black Hills country, not a war chief. A chief the way an old tree is a chief of a grove, by being there the longest and still standing. I was 52 winters old. My wife had died 3 years before in the summer of fever that took 11 people from our band in 6 weeks. My son had gone to follow a young war leader east 2 winters before that, and I hadn't heard from him since. I had my sister. I had the band. I had the work. That is not nothing. I want to be clear that I knew it wasn't nothing. But there is a particular kind of hollow a man carries when the person who knew him best is gone, and it was that hollow I carried. Every morning I rose and did what needed doing. Every night I lay down and waited for sleep that came slow. I was not unhappy exactly. I was useful. I was needed. I was respected by my people and by neighboring bands and by 2 or 3 white men I'd traded with who were fair. But I was alone in the particular way a man is alone, when there's no one left on earth who remembers the boy he used to be. The woman's name, I would learn, was Thatchewin, Wind Woman. She had come from a band 3 days' ride south, following a husband who had been killed in a raid the autumn before, trying to reach a cousin's camp that turned out to be further than she'd reckoned. She'd been traveling alone. The child had come too early, more than a month too early in the night in the cold with no one. She'd done what she could. She'd wrapped the child. Then she tried to keep walking, and her legs had given out. She told me this in pieces over the following days, sitting up in my lodge wrapped in a buffalo robe with a bowl of broth in her hands. She told it plainly, without embellishment, without self-pity, pausing sometimes to find a word and other times pausing for a reason I didn't fully understand until later, which was simply that she was listening to what she just said, measuring it against something inside herself, making sure it was true before she went on. I recognized that habit. My wife had done the same thing. She was younger than me by perhaps 15 years. Her face was not what you'd call soft. She'd been through things that left marks, not scars exactly, but a quality around the eyes like weathered wood, something that had been tested and held. Her hands were capable hands, a worker's hands. The first day she was well enough to sit up, she looked around my lodge and her eyes went to a torn piece of rawhide lacing on a parfleche near the door, and before I could say anything she'd reached over and picked it up and begun mending it with a piece of sinew from her own kit. She hadn't asked. She just saw a thing that needed doing and did it. I watched her do it. I didn't say anything. I felt something move in me that I hadn't felt in a long time, and I didn't name it. I just noted it and went about my work. She stayed 6 days. I told her she could stay as long as she needed, that the snow was wrong for travel and that her strength was still coming back. She said little about that, but she didn't argue. She helped Witch Handby with the cooking, and the camp work with a competence that my sister noted with a small nod that is, from Witch Handby, high praise. On the 5th day she asked me to show her where I'd found the child so she could say the prayers properly, and I walked with her to the cottonwood and stood back while she spoke to the sky and the snow and the small mound I'd made there. I had marked it with stones, 4 of them, set in the Lakota way without being asked. She stood looking at the stones for a long time. Then she looked at me. "You did this," she said. It wasn't a question. "It seemed right," I said. She held my gaze for a moment that I found difficult to read, and then she turned back to the grave and spoke a few more words too quiet to hear. When she came back to stand beside me, she was composed, not cold. There's a difference. And we walked back to camp without speaking, which felt to me like exactly the right thing. On the 6th day, she told me her cousin's camp was likely too far to reach before the deep cold settled in. She said it without looking at me, working a piece of hide in her lap. I said there was a corner of my lodge she was welcome to until spring. My sister was already sleeping there. I said we were not children, and we had both been through worse things, and there was no reason to make more of an arrangement than it was. She looked up at me then. "You are careful, man," she said. "I've been called worse," I said. She made a sound that might have been a laugh. Then she looked back down at her work and said, quietly, "All right." Winter settled in hard 3 days later, the kind of cold that makes the trees crack at night like rifle shots. We were confined close, me, Thatchewin, Witch Handby, and the particular rhythms of a lodge with 3 people in it who are learning each other's habits. My sister is a woman who notices everything and says very little. She watched Thatchewin the way she watches everything, with a patience that has no impatience under it. And after the first week, I caught her teaching Thaddeus the particular way she stitches moccasin soles, a stitch my sister invented herself and has never taught anyone, because she said no one had ever been worth the bother. When I mentioned this to Witch Handpy later, she looked at me as if I'd said something very slow-witted and went back to her work. I don't want to make it sound like a gentle thing, those winter months. It wasn't gentle exactly. It was close quarters and hard cold, and there were days the wind screamed at the lodge cover from before dawn until long after dark, and days we ran low on wood and had to be careful, and once a week of bitter cold so deep that even with the fire high we slept in our robes in the afternoon just to stay warm. There's nothing romantic about that kind of winter. You are practical or you are in trouble. But there were nights. There were nights when the wind let up and the fire was good and Witch Handpy fell asleep early, which she does, and it was just the two of us sitting across the coals from each other. On one of those nights, very late, Thaddeus asked me about my wife. Just straight out, what was she like? I wasn't startled by the question. I found I wanted to answer it. I talked for a long time. I talked about her laugh, which was louder than you'd expect from a woman of her composure. It surprised you every time. I talked about the way she'd argued with me, directly and without any softening, which I'd resented when I was younger and valued more than almost anything by the end. I talked about the morning she died, and what I'd said to her, and what she'd said back, and how I'd walked out of that lodge and stood in the sun and felt something in my chest like a door swinging open on an empty room. I hadn't told anyone any of that, not even Witch Handpy. Thaddeus listened with her full attention, not performing attention, actually present. When I was done, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "She sounds like someone who knew her own mind." "She did," I said. "It used to make me crazy." "I know that feeling," she said, and the way she said it, dry, certain, made me look at her across the fire. She was looking at me with something that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to one. Then she looked down at her hands. "Tell me about him," I said. "Your husband." She did. She was briefer than I'd been, not because she'd loved him less, I think, but because she's a woman who lives closer to the surface of the present than the past. She told me the things she missed. She told me one thing she didn't miss, which made me respect her more. She told me she'd been 2 months along when he was killed and hadn't known it yet, and that by the time she'd understood what her body was doing, she'd already decided to keep moving, because stillness felt more dangerous than cold. "You did the right thing," I said. "I did the only thing," she said. Then she looked up at me again, and this time the something in her face was not adjacent to a smile. It was something else, plainer and more direct. She held my gaze for a breath longer than was necessary, and then she said, "You are not what I expected." "What did you expect?" I asked. "A chief," she said. "You are a man." I didn't know what to do with that, so I said nothing. The fire shifted. A log settled. Outside the wind was still and the cold was absolute, and the world was reduced to the circle of light between us, and I sat in it and felt it for a moment without reaching for anything, without building anything up around it to keep it at a manageable distance. Just felt it. The warmth of the fire on my face and the weight of what she'd said and the fact of her, sitting there, having chosen to stay. She did not leave in the spring. I want to say that plainly because the plainness of it is the whole point. When the snow broke and the first mud came, and a rider from the south brought word that her cousin's band had moved further east into new territory, she was in my lodge. By then everyone in camp knew the shape of things. No one had said much about it. Witch Handpy had moved back to her own lodge in the 3rd month, with a self-satisfied air that she didn't bother to conceal. The situation had defined itself the way situations do when two people stop pretending to be something they aren't. But I asked her, formally, because she deserved to be asked rather than assumed. I went to where she was working outside in the first real light of that first warm day, tanning a hide she'd been working on for weeks, and I stood there until she looked up. I said what I intended to say, which was that I wanted her to stay, that I was asking her to stay, that I was not a young man and I had nothing romantic to offer her, and I wouldn't dress it up in things it wasn't, but that I would be a fair and steady man and I would provide for her and protect her, and she would never be alone in the particular way she'd been alone on that trail in the snow. I said all of that standing in the mud in the thin spring light, feeling about as exposed as I'd felt since I was a young man asking a different woman a different question. She listened to all of it without interrupting. Then she put down her scraper and she stood up and she stepped close to me, so close I could see the pale scar above her left eyebrow that I'd wondered about but hadn't asked, and she put both hands on either side of my face and held it, the way you hold something you don't want to drop. She looked at me for a moment that stretched out long and quiet. Then she said, "You found me in the snow and you carried me in your arms and you kept me warm and you marked my child's grave with stones and you sat awake all night and you thought I didn't see any of that, but I see all of it." I didn't say anything. "I have been watching you for 3 months," she said. "I know what you are." Her hands were warm on my face. The sun was coming over the ridge to the east, low and thin and yellow, and it caught the edge of her hair. I put my hands over hers, not to move them, just to hold them there. We stood like that for a moment that I have thought about many times since. "All right," she said, "I'll stay." That was 11 years ago now. I've been trying to think of something wise to say about those 11 years, but I don't think wisdom is what they amount to. What they amount to is this. I wake up in the morning and there is someone beside me who knows me. Not the chief. Not the thing I present to the world, the steadiness and the certainty, and the man who has the right answer when the band needs one. She knows the man who woke up some mornings in those early winters still reaching for a woman who wasn't there anymore. She knows I'm afraid of the deep river crossings in high water, have been since I was young, never told anyone that until I told her. She knows I'm proud of my son even now, and sometimes that pride is indistinguishable from grief, and she knows those two things can occupy the same space at the same time without canceling each other out. She told me once that the night she heard me walking above her in the snow, she'd thought she was already dead and I was something else. A spirit, maybe. She said she'd decided it didn't matter. She said she'd thought, "All right, whatever you are, I will come with you because wherever you're going is warmer than here." I thought about that for a long time. What it means to be found. What it means to be the one who finds. How those two things, sometimes in the right circumstances, turn out to be the same thing. Last winter she got sick, just a cold. A bad one, nothing that took her far. But for 3 days she slept and I sat up beside her the way she'd sat beside me through the sicknesses I'd had in those years. And I watched her breathe in the firelight. And I thought about the cottonwood at the edge of the creek bed, and the pulse under her throat, and the weight of her in my arms, and the snow and the dark, and the 30 steps between almost losing her and the rest of my life. She opened her eyes on the 3rd morning and looked up and I was there, close, watching her. She took in my face, the worry I hadn't managed to completely hide, and she made a sound low in her throat that was half impatient and half amused and half something else. "Still here," she said. "Still here," I said. She closed her eyes. I put my hand over hers and the fire was warm and outside the snow was coming down the way snow comes down when it means to stay, heavy and quiet, covering everything.